The world is full of religions and philosophies. What does the Christian need to know about philosophy, and how can that help him in the missionary task? We'll explore that and more today on the show. But first, let me tell you about Daniel. Daniel fled his home in Peru when he was 12 years old after his drunken father threatened to kill him. Daniel became an alcoholic like his father. One day, he ended up at a local church. But as a Roman Catholic from his upbringing, Daniel resisted the evangelical gospel that he heard and vowed to disprove Christianity itself. Well, that didn't last long. Daniel was converted, and he developed a passion to share the gospel with the lost. That's when ABWE missionary Steve Douglas noticed and began discipling him for 9 years. Today, Daniel has founded a seminary in his city of Arequipa, and he's planted 15 churches of his own. Daniel's special, but he's not unique. We're finding partners like these all over the world. And in this changing global climate, we can continue to do greater things for the Great Commission by partnering with people on the field, already risking all to make disciples. Your gift to the Global Gospel Fund can impact 1,000 missionaries working in more than 70 nations. Become a partner now. Go to abwe.org/globalgospelfund20. That's abwe.org/globalgospelfund20.
Have you ever been approached by a student expressing a missionary call? For the last 15 years, Spurgeon College's Fusion program has been equipping students for missions through life-on-life discipleship, college coursework, and intensely practical training. If you know a student desiring to become a missionary, send them to Fusion at Spurgeon College as their next step. To learn more about how we are equipping students for a lifetime, visit spurgeoncollege.com/fusion.
Welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. Here with you again, Alex Kochman, Director of Advancement and Communications with ABWE International, joined by my partner in crime for yet another sunny December 2020 day, Scott Dunford, West Coast Advancement Coordinator, but he's also a lead church planter at Redeemer Church in Fremont, California. Excuse me, sorry, my notes are wrong here.
Come on. Oh, it's good. It's good to be with you, and California is not that bad.
Well, speaking of, man, you're going through a lot at your church right now. What's the quick summary for those of our listeners interested in hearing?
Well, we've been ministering outside. We've had 3 churches in our area that are all smaller and joining together with us, and we're just keep worshiping. We have a big tent up and we put heaters out, and we're just going to keep plugging away through the winter and just continue to pray. We're in the process of merging with another church, and of course, as you could kind of imagine, none of that is easy, and I really need wisdom and strength. So I really appreciate anyone who's praying for us and our church plant out here.
Yeah, church merger sounds easy. I can't think of any ways that would be stressful, really at all. So I guess there's nothing more to say about that. But Scott, our guest today is going to help us answer the question we posed at the beginning of the show. And you think about philosophy, and most people's eyes glaze over, right? I don't know about you, but I remember struggling in philosophy class in my undergrad and being really interested in the topics, but just having a heck of a time trying to figure out how this had any kind of practical significance to life, much less ministry. But our guest here today is going to help us apply those things and hopefully give us some handles on some of the foreign and pagan religious worldviews that we handle, which I think is much needed.
Yeah, and it's my great pleasure to introduce one of my professors at Midwestern and someone who I've learned a lot from. I don't know if he'd claim me or not, but I began thinking about philosophy differently in his classes, especially the ones that were pertaining to missions and world religions. And so we have Dr. Thor Madsen with us. He's been at Midwestern since 1999. He's the Dean of Graduate Studies and the PhD Program Director and Professor of New Testament Ethics and Philosophy. He's also a research fellow for the Christian Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission at the Southern Baptist Convention. And he's got many articles out there all over the place. He also loves motorcycling, skiing, shooting, sports. And of course, he's married, has 2 sons, Paul and Timothy. And we are so thankful to have you on the show. Thank you, Dr. Madsen, for joining us.
Obviously.
Thank you for joining us, and welcome.
Glad to be with you.
So
We should probably make a couple jokes about Thor and the Avengers and being named Thor, but I
yeah,
can't
he's
think of
never
any
heard
right
that
now.
before.
So we'll just move on.
Right.
So I know you have a passion for missions. You've been involved with the International Mission Board and, of course, different mission outreaches that Midwestern Seminary has done. And one thing I love about Midwestern is that it is a mission school through and through. Where did you develop your passion for other cultures and missions in particular?
I suppose it's best to say that it comes almost as a inheritance from family. The reason why I say that is that on my mother's side, my grandparents were missionaries in Western Borneo for 60 years and started in the late 1930s. Had obviously, you can imagine an interruption to that during the Second World War when the Japanese invaded what was then called the Dutch East Indies. They escaped. I think that's the right word. There's no other word to use. They escaped from being caught by the Japanese troops moving into Western Borneo. They were interested in Borneo for the rubber, oil, and gas, those kinds of raw materials. And they were stateside during the war, during which time my grandfather was one of the three who started New Tribes Mission. And right after the war ended, he immediately went back to Borneo, where he continued to serve. And I just grew up hearing about this, grew up hearing about his life and so forth. And since then, I mean, obviously, this is many years downstream from there. I went and visited Indonesia when he was just about 80. And I remember my mother at the time saying, your grandfather's not getting any younger. You should probably, if you're going to, do this at all to see his work and understand what he's doing, you should probably do that now. Of course, he lived to be mid-90s. But at the time, it was really quite eye-opening, as they knew it would be. And at the time, I was a student at Trinity Divinity School in Chicago. So it was logical that I would be interested in this in any case. And it was just a very eye-opening thing to see. He was, in his day, very much what we would think of as a pioneer missionary in the full sense of that word, and had conducted a very fruitful ministry in Western Borneo among a tribe known as the Dayaks, which were if you think about in your own mind, what picture should you have of a wild man of Borneo, the headhunter with the and so forth. That was his tribe. I mean, that's who they were. And he had a tremendous ministry there. And as I say, 60 years later, after founding a school there as well in Pontianak, which is on the west coast of Borneo, he never really retired. He died of old age. He was in his mid-90s, but that's the legacy. That's where I got drawn into it, and have always just enjoyed being in other places like that. So I've done mission trips with Dr. Robin Hadaway, who's a missions professor at Midwestern, and he had obviously had a tremendous amount of experience culminating his missionary career as a regional leader in South America, but he had been serving in North Africa, Tanzania, and then finally in Brazil. And so he was obviously a very valuable person to get even more exposure to this than I had at that point. But that's kind of the essence of it. And it's always been intriguing to me to see that. And we've traveled together, he and I, to Burma, Indonesia, Ethiopia, places like that. And of course, I've been to Europe several times.
So why should Christians be students of philosophy, Thor? And specifically, why should missionaries care about philosophy? You know, we do find that topic daunting. And yet, what I also find daunting is going out and looking at all of the world's religions and trying to figure out, you know, how one might contextualize the gospel message in each of those settings. Maybe there's a way to simplify some of that.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think what I would want to do is start off by clarifying what philosophy is. And as you can imagine, philosophers argue even about that. What is it that they do? You know, but it's pretty standard that one can say a couple of things. One of them is that philosophy is the effort to determine what is the adequate worldview. So I'm just going to explain what a worldview is. And as I do that, I think it will become clear that worldviews and religions are pretty much coextensive ideas. In other words, they're not fundamentally different. So what is that? Well, worldviews or religions, you choose the word you want. They are systems of belief that answer three big questions that are the agenda items of philosophy. Number one is what exists. So just to give an example, in Christianity, we believe in the existence of God. We believe in angels, demons. We believe in a linear view of history, that it's not cyclical, but it starts, it has a middle, and it has an end, moving toward what we would call the end, the eschaton, right? The eternal state. And that marks us as being different from somebody like an atheist who would think that, you know, all of reality consists of matter and energy and what those do. There's no God, nothing like God, and so forth. And that's one question. So the question of existence is the first one. The second one is the question of knowledge. What can we know and how do we know what we do? So that turns out to be a very complex area of philosophy, as you can imagine. But this is one of the major areas. So you have the question of existence, the question of knowledge, and then finally the question of value. What is a value? What duties do we have? What makes a person good or evil? Those kinds of questions factor into that third domain. So philosophy is the effort to answer life's big questions, life's ultimate unavoidable questions, the question of existence, knowledge, and value. And that's what religions do. Now, religions have other aspects to them. They're practical, they have symbolism, they have rites and so forth. All that's true. But those rites and symbols and practices and customs are outworkings of the fundamental beliefs that they have about existence, knowledge, and value. So that's what philosophy is about. And what you do then in philosophy is you find yourself being caught up in discussions about what you might call basic concepts that apply to all the disciplines. So just as an example, in Christian theology, we may talk about the Holy Spirit causing a certain effect to happen in a person's life. How would a philosophy person interpret that? Well, one question you could ask is, what does it mean to cause something? There's these basic concepts like cause, effect. When we say that the Bible is completely true, which I would, right? You then have to ask the question, what does it mean for a claim that we make to be true? What is that actually saying? Or what do we mean by time? What do we mean by eternity? Just some of these basic concepts that are found in all the disciplines, from chemistry to history to art, psychology, you name it. They're the concepts that we can't get away from. They always keep coming back. And the difference between philosophy and these other disciplines is that philosophy gives specialized attention to those basic concepts that pervade all the other disciplines. So that's what philosophy is. And one thing, you could certainly agree, I think you would, that if you think about that effort to answer those basic questions, it seems pretty clear, doesn't it, that the Bible also answers those questions.
Right.
So that's where you get this potential for conflict. I don't think it always needs to be there, but it's certainly a potential for conflict where the philosophers may be saying one thing and the Bible is saying something else. And there, in Christian philosophy, our commitment is to the idea that the Bible is the ultimate standard that we use to understand the results of philosophy. So we live with a kind of ongoing conversation or dialogue between scripture and philosophy. But in my case, and this would be true of Christian philosophy in general, or at least it ought to be, that the Bible wins. In the end, the Bible wins. So now you have to ask more difficult questions about how one negotiates that relationship between the two.
So I kind of have a question, and because I can imagine what maybe some of our listeners are thinking as you're especially talking about, hey, these deep questions about like cause and time and some of the things you talked about. I could imagine someone saying, well, why do we need to spend time thinking about that? Everyone knows what that is. What would you say to someone who maybe, responds and saying, why would I need to study those kind of questions? That's just something everyone knows.
Well, it gets down to this issue of what it means to be confident that one knows a certain thing. So famously, I'll just give you an illustration. The medieval theologian and philosopher Augustine of Hippo one time said it this way, I think I know what time is until somebody asks me. Then I don't know. In other words, he recognized that it's very difficult to explain what it is. And what I would say more generally is that I certainly wouldn't deny that a person can live a godly, wonderful, fruitful Christian life and please the Lord in every sense without giving much thought to philosophy. That is certainly the case.
Sure.
But it's also true that person is presupposing philosophical conclusions that other people are going to find interesting. And whether we acknowledge the fact or not, those kinds of questions are going to surface for some people. They always have for me. In other words, I was the kind of person who would be the kid in the room who would ask that. In other words, somebody would say one thing causes another. I would be like, okay, and we mean what by cause? Do you see what I mean? That was just sort of a normal thing for me to do. I don't always know that I was doing it without the intent to be mischievous. I would ask those kinds of questions and seem to do so from a pretty early age. And you just have to recognize that a certain number of people that you'll encounter in daily life, they're going to ask those questions. And at that point, you have a choice. Either you have no answer or you have one. And that's certainly what philosophy does. And just to give an example, very practically, we believe that our theological conclusions should come from Scripture. And we further believe that our theological conclusions should come from Scripture rightly interpreted. Well, if I just take that statement, rightly interpreted, or that phrase, I should say, now comes the question, what counts as a good interpretation? Like, what are the ground rules? Well, you find out that's a philosophical question. That's a discipline known as hermeneutics, and it raises those kinds of questions. What does it mean for us to handle the Scriptures rightly? How do we know when we've done that successfully? That turns out to be a question that people in other areas of literature also ask. What is a successful interpretation of a Shakespearean play? What is the right way to understand the U.S. Constitution? What is the right way to understand a contract drawn up between two people? These are all interpretive questions, and they go back to the same initial puzzle that I raised earlier. What counts as a good interpretation? So you really can't actually avoid wrestling with philosophical questions. And one famous writer, G.K. Chesterton, put it this way. He said, philosophy is just going to intrude It's going to come up. It's going to be there whether you want it to or not. And the only question then for anybody who's faced with it is, will somebody else do the thinking for you, or will you do your own thinking? Those are the two options that you have. And he obviously said it with the intent to urge us to do our own thinking and to test the tests that we apply to questions of value and knowledge and so forth.
I have a question, though, with some of this. So, yeah, obviously there's massive overlap here between terms that at times we use interchangeably: worldview, philosophy, religion, right? It's all about those foundational assumptions that you have about who are we, what are we doing here, why are we here? And that can, I think, be helpful to get us some handles on when we go to the mission field. All right, how do I really understand the religion here? If it's a major religion, if it's a tribal religion, or if it's no religion, at least no recognized religion. How do we make sense of that? But at the same time, we're speaking very magnanimously of philosophy. And the Apostle Paul at times is kind of down on philosophy in the New Testament. He warns us of vain philosophy. So where do you draw that line? How is it helpful? But then when can it be cumbersome and dangerous? One thing that we're always concerned with on this show is we want goers to think, yes, but we also want thinkers to go. And I think sometimes we can spend too much time thinking and not enough time putting shoe leather on our faith.
Right. Well, I think the answer is kind of this. There is going to be some ultimate source of authority that everybody has. That's not, again, and that's a statement I'm making not just as a Christian, although I would want to make it, but as a person who's interested in philosophy. There will be something treated as ultimately authoritative. The only question is, what is that? And for many people in this world, their ultimate source of authority is their own private intuition. So we hear people say, well, I follow my heart on these things. I trust my own instincts and so forth. And when they're doing that, I don't obviously think that's the right way to go, but just more generally, if you step back from that, you would see, well, they are treating something as ultimately authoritative. Other people will say science. Science is it. So these days, in the era of pandemics and so forth, people will say, well, I will follow the science, and science now enjoys a kind of primacy on the part of many people in the United States and around the world that is almost, you're almost forbidden to challenge it. You're not allowed to say yes, but. But that at that point, a person is thinking that science has an ultimacy, it has an authority. And what I would therefore want to say is the danger would be of philosophy is if a person has no true north that can be used to check the speculative flights that philosophy gets involved with. And that's when you start to get very crazy answers to life's ultimate questions. And you can see that, of course, in all kinds of areas, but particularly in world religions, where, some of the belief systems that one might encounter are just really so difficult in terms of wondering, how did anybody come up with this? Why does anybody believe this? Why does this seem right to these people? And that's an illustration of where speculative thought of the kind that philosophy gets involved with can go awry. And let's just say it often does.
Yeah, it does. And we even live in a culture now here in the West where instead of asking these philosophical underpinning questions, it's all reduced to a matter of taste, which makes apologetics even more challenging, if not sometimes impossible, at least in the way that we typically conceive of apologetics in terms of evidence. And so there's some important kind of differences between what's going on in the East and what's going on in the West right now. We want to dive into that a little bit more and ask Dr. Madsen here a few more questions. So we'll be right back with Thor Madsen of Midwestern Seminary.
Hi, I'm Scott Dunford, and I'd like to share with you about a new nonprofit ministry established to help churches, Christian schools, and other ministries protect children and prevent abuse. Rich Hemar from Church Law and Tax states that the number one reason that drives churches to court is child sexual abuse. I can't think of anything more devastating to these lives, their families, and our witness before a watching world than sexual abuse that takes place in ministry. The traumatic impact often leaves the vulnerable not wanting anything to do with God or His people. Our efforts toward evangelism, discipleship, and spiritual formation are not only neutralized, but shattered. Evangelical Counsel for Abuse Prevention was formed to help ministry leaders understand the complexities of child protection and abuse prevention. They are establishing standards and an accreditation program that will help verify that appropriate measures are in place at your church or ministry. Learn more about them and find a helpful and free assessment tool to help you see how you measure up in this area. Go to abuseprevention.org and click on the link for this resource assessment. Evangelical Counsel for Abuse Prevention.
And this June, attend the national conference. Go to abuseprevention.org and register with ABWE21 as the promo code to receive 20% off your ticket. That's promo code ABWE21 to receive 20% off. Brooks Buser, president of Radius International.
I am here with Mark Dever, senior pastor at Capitol Hill Baptist and president of 9 Marks.
When you go to a culture that's a different language than yours, you're ending up in a kind of majority language that's been reached. And there are other peoples still more hidden, and it's those people who are often almost entirely unreached, and they take more cross-cultural effort. Is there a way we can better train people to have more realistic expectations of what life is like in the kind of 2 steps away from my culture, and be able to sustain family life with its normal difficulties there, so that there can be a long years and even decades-long witness in that culture? And it seems like Radius is set up to provide that training. Radius is about reaching unreached people groups.
Go to radiusinternational.org. Radiusinternational.org.
We are back with Dr. Thor Madsen of Midwestern Seminary, discussing how philosophy can be used in reaching other cultures and understanding even our own culture and communicating the gospel. So, Dr. Madsen, I've spent quite a bit of time thinking and researching, living in the East, but also studying Taoism and Buddhism, particularly Hinduism, and certainly as you start diving into these religions and philosophies, oftentimes I find my head's just spinning. And can you talk a little bit about, when we think of philosophy, we often think of Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. But there also is a school of Eastern philosophy. What are some of the differences between Eastern and Western philosophy? And as Christians, could we say one is superior to the other, or how should we even look at those 2 schools?
One thing I would want to say is that the great difficulty that Western people have in engaging with Eastern religions. And for this purpose, I'll just set to one side Islam, because you asked about, for example, Hinduism and Buddhism and so forth. And so I'll just confine my answer to those for the moment. Here's what turns out to be difficult. And that is, the followers of these religions are not going to approach the big questions of life with the same degree of rigor and analytical urgency. Like they don't really do that. And that means, just more informally, they're comfortable with a lack of systematizing in their beliefs. They just don't press those questions as much as people in the West might do. Now, I will say that right now in North American culture, we're seeing a greater tolerance, even on our part, for contradictory beliefs, unclear beliefs, emotively driven beliefs that don't have evidence to support them, and so forth. We're seeing that too. But you get much more of that in these religions that go back a very long time. But there are some common features, and that's one of the things that philosophy helps a person to do, is to zero in on the essential beliefs. In other words, the beliefs that make the particular worldview what it is. And if you were to get rid of one of those beliefs, then it wouldn't be what it is. So as an example, in the Far East, what you tend to have is expressions of what missionaries and missiologists would call the Samsara Paradigm. Okay, so that's a very complicated term. What on earth, right?
Yes.
It just goes like this. Paradigm just means pattern, setup, system. So that word we don't need to trouble ourselves with too much. It just means pattern. Samsaric refers to this kind of interpretation. That is, life history doesn't proceed in a linear way. It's cyclical. In other words, it goes round and round. And when it comes to the question of what we're to make of life, what you're going to find in Hinduism and, for example, Buddhism is the assumption that human life involves suffering. And as long as you exist, you're caught up in this wheel, this cycle of birth, death, and rebirth combined with suffering that then is called samsara. And you have Hinduism putting that down as a main idea, and then Buddhism would be viewed as sort of a departure from that. But it basically is the same idea that you have this wheel of suffering that we're caught up with, and what one wants to do is to escape from the wheel of suffering, the wheel of death and rebirth. And if you were to experience that kind of personal extinction, that blowing out of the candle, if you will, that would be nirvana. So it's not the idea that one is to live in such a way that you experience final, eternal, indescribable happiness. That isn't really the goal. It's to get to a place where you are personally extinguished. And that's what, for example, the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, that was his, if you follow the Hindu or Buddhist story, that would have been his original insight that he would have received, assuming this is true, which I don't, but the original insight was that he perceived his own impermanence and recognized that to live is to suffer, and therefore one wants to extinguish desire. And if you do that, then you can experience the personal void that we should actually reach for and long to experience. So you just have to recognize that that's kind of how people are going to view the human condition in the Far East. It does have a degree of pessimism about it. It's not entirely that, but there's a strong current in these societies that life is negative. In other words, right. And we get that. I mean, we understand. I mean, people do suffer. There are terrible things that occur. It's just that what you now have is a belief system that is built on the foundation that suffering is simply a part of the human condition, and it's the main part.
So when you're trying to address, some of these ideas that come out of, Eastern philosophies and even as much as we talk about, Hinduism or Buddhism as separate things, living in Asia, one is able to see, the confluence of Taoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, and then of course, Hinduism is very tied into Buddhism. And so those things all kind of seem to bleed into one another, right. Especially some of these ideas of rebirth and the secular nature of things and impermanence and some of the very basics of what is reality is often so different than Western philosophy. So the question is that I want to know is, can Western philosophical tools, and even just the fact that we have a whole way of thinking that is so shaped by philosophy, even the theological terminologies we use that are not biblical are often shaped by philosophy. And even some of the biblical authors use philosophical language and argument from Western philosophy. So are Western philosophical tools helpful in doing apologetics, you think, in non-Western cultures?
They can be. And I suppose the way to put it is to recognize there's two ways in which that can be so, that they can be helpful. One of them is that they can, the missionary himself, to right size the challenge in front of him. So just to take, for example, a case in point, one thing you can certainly say about all religions, this seems to be a common feature, is that they kind of have a diagnosis structure. So what you have is a diagnosis of the human condition. There's a set of beliefs that define what ails us as human beings. And then there's a prescribed cure, something that you're supposed to do to address the human condition, whatever that might be. So, for example, in Christianity, the diagnosis is sin and Jesus is the answer. I'm oversimplifying that, but that's kind of the idea. In Islam, the diagnosis is idolatry, and the cure is submission to the Quran and Sharia, to forsake idols and all the rest of it. In Buddhism, it's the recognition of who you are as an impermanent, transient being. In fact, it's even incorrect to say you have a soul. You don't even have that. You're a stream of conscious events, and you're to recognize that escape from samsara comes in the form of the pathway of Buddhism that you're to follow. And so it can help on one side where you can rightly understand what you're facing. And then on the other side, it certainly is possible to engage somebody who follows one of these other belief systems simply by recognizing that the way that we think in the West is also the way they think in certain settings. Okay. In other words, so for example, if you're talking to a person in India who's an engineer, or a doctor or what have you, they're going to think in a Western way about those kinds of things, or finance. They're not going to be comfortable with fuzzy math when it comes to finance, right? It's just not how that works, right? Okay, they're going to be standards of rigor, standards of reasoning about matters of that kind, or law, in example. But now comes the question, is there a good reason to throw all that away once one gets to life's ultimate questions? And the answer would have to be no. And that's part of what one is to be alert to, is these gaps between certain types of thinking that you're going to find in world religions. And of course, they'll think the same way about us. You understand that. They'll have views about what we believe and will be equally eager to suggest that we're too narrow, we're wrong-headed, etc. And that's, of course, where engagement occurs.
And that's also helpful, I think, for people in the West who are living in kind of the postmodern mindset of everything has become a matter of preference. And, what's true for me is not necessarily true for somebody else. Again, we don't apply that to engineering. We don't apply that to science and some of these other things. Now, increasingly, we are actually applying that across the board. We do now. Yeah. But, at the same time, I think a good apologist is going to go in and ask someone, look at the foundation that you're standing on. Is that, set of presuppositions, assumptions, is that, consistent with the way that you live life every day? Or do you live life every single day, regardless of what kind of culture you live in, assuming things like induction, assuming things like, a certain logic where, I know that the sun is going to come up again today. Why? Because it came up the last, X number of days that I've been alive. We know that intuitively because we live in God's world and we're stamped with His image, and our mind is shaped after His mind. And by the way, I think that's why referring to all of that as Western isn't always helpful. That's Christian logic there. It's come to mark the West, and we inherited a lot from the Greeks, perhaps. And you go back to the patristic writers, and they regarded some of the Greek philosophers as almost a type of pagan prophet, because they were like, wow, how did they stumble on all of this truth without access to special revelation?
Sure.
But the reality is that's the Christian worldview way of thinking, and increasingly you see it's Christ or chaos, and outside of that there is logical inconsistency. And so I think there's room to go in and help people see, what foundation are you standing on? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do agree that you can find, for example, early Christian writers like Augustine, for example, being very generous about how he views pagan philosophical speculation that went before him. He thinks it's wrong where it is wrong, but he also is able to see and wants that to be understood that God used his exposure to these ideas that came before him to prepare him to see the logic of Christianity, to see that it makes sense. And it's certainly true that there's the use of the word Western can be a problem in the sense that that's kind of like saying Western mathematics as opposed to what? What's going to be the alternative? Imagine somebody saying, I've got mathematics that applies to people living in Arizona but not Texas or something. You'd be like, what are you talking about? Like, it's just transcends that, right? So similarly with Christianity, it is one way to put it is you would certainly have somebody like Thomas Aquinas wanting to think of it this way: is it's theology, but he would also want it to be seen as the perennial philosophy. In other words, it's the evergreen, always true, always strong philosophical position to take. And by that, he just means it's a belief system that stands up to scrutiny. And this is not what's going to be true of alternative religions. They will not. And part of what you would have to recognize in that is that in the Western philosophical tradition, especially, Christianity has been the major player. In other words, if you think about it, if you were to remove Christians from the Western philosophical tradition, you don't leave much. It's very hard to see how that could have gone. And what that then means is that our beliefs have withstood the scrutiny and the challenges and have been made stronger because of that engagement, where they have been defended always with reference to Scripture. When that's not been true, of course, that's a totally different thing. You're kind of surrendering at that point. If you just push the Bible aside and then say whatever you want to say, then you kind of are conceding your opponent's point at that stage. But so far as people hang on to Scripture and they're trying to be faithful to that, but rigorous in their thinking, that's a very powerful combination.
And one of the reasons I think that philosophy scares people sometimes is because they think that they're going to end up in this endless web of subjectivity. And how do I know that, there's terra firma beneath my feet and all those sorts of things.
Yeah.
But when you talk about, Western philosophy, quote unquote, many times often that word Western is this boogeyman, but really what do people mean? They mean, Christendom and everything that Christendom has touched throughout the last 2 millennia. And when we recognize, that the Christian worldview, the Christian view of life and reality is something solid, that is going to give me some tools through which I can analyze Buddhism or Hinduism or Islam or secularism or neo-paganism, right? And things that are resurging throughout the West, and see not only where it's out of step with Scripture, but also where it's not even consistent with itself and the way that we're wired to live as people that bear the Imago Dei. So for somebody, especially somebody with a heart for cross-cultural missions and who wants to impact people, that don't look and act and talk like them, right? Where would you say would be a good starting point with this topic?
To investigate philosophy? Yeah. There's a good accessible book out there that I'm actually working on revising, as it turns out. So this is not, I'm going to recommend it quite apart from that. But it's called Life's Ultimate Questions. And the author is Ronald H. Nash. He's and there's another book that he's written that's shorter called Worldviews in Conflict. And Nash he understands philosophy the way I do, which is philosophy is the effort to search for an adequate worldview. That's how he understands it. And he's a believing Christian. He's with the Lord now, but I mean, as an author, that's what you'd see. Very committed to rigorous thinking, but at the same time, committed to faithfulness to the gospel. And I just think that they're very accessible. Another good one is by James Sire, that The Universe Next Door. Very accessible, and all of these are written by people who are believing Christians. They're not, it's not like reading something by Bertrand Russell or who knows what, they're with you on those things, but they show the value of looking into these questions. And they also share the conviction that they're unavoidable. I mean, they're not going to go away just because we pretend that they don't exist. They do. And I would say this is to be true, is that no matter how agnostic a person pretends to be, or how flexible he or she is in whatever beliefs that person may affirm, everybody you meet is living out some kind of worldview, because everybody you meet is making consequential decisions.
Right.
Everybody is. Even if you choose not to decide, you're deciding. I mean, there's no way to get away from making consequential decisions as a human being. And therefore, you're either going to do that having thought through your principles carefully, or you're just going to get up every day and say, I feel. But either way you go, you're going to be making consequential decisions. And one of the things that authors like that bring out is the inevitability of worldview level thinking. We're not going to be able to get away from it. And so therefore, similarly, anybody you meet anywhere in the world, they're living out some worldview. And those worldviews can be rationally assessed. I mean, we can actually look at them and make calls as far as their adequacy goes.
Yeah. So we want to come in for a landing, but as we conclude, what would be a danger for somebody who really wants to immerse themselves in understanding worldviews and the biblical worldview, but also, philosophies from one culture to the next, and really wants to say, I want to do a lot of comparative religions work. I really want to dive deep into apologetics. What would be some guardrails that you'd put on that, some dangers for them to avoid?
Just being inconsistent in their walk with Christ. There's no substitute for an awareness and a deepening awareness of what the scriptures do tell us. I put it this way. I mean, Christians do philosophy with an unfair advantage in the sense that we kind of know what the answers are. The interesting thing is to figure out what reasons we can give for those answers that we know are already correct. I mean, we have an unfair advantage, if you want to put it that way. And it would be terrible for a person to substitute speculative philosophical reasoning for biblical exegesis. That's a mistake. And I have my foot in both of those worlds. I teach New Testament and I teach philosophy. And if it push comes to shove, and I have to emphasize the one over the other, certainly I'm going to emphasize the New Testament. I absolutely will. But I'm interested in these questions to do with apologetics and philosophy. It's not ungodly to find that interesting. It can be useful in defending the faith, to clarifying the faith, and to developing a strong sense of God's majesty. That's what comes out so clearly when you compare the Christian worldview with every other one. It's not even close. So from that standpoint, there's much to be seen there. But I would tell you that I would feel very sad about the idea that there's anybody listening to this who would say, oh, good, I can kind of dispense with the Bible and speculate my way into orthodoxy. Well, no, you're not. It's not going to happen. I mean, for one thing, human beings are fallen. I mean, we're going to believe too often what we want to believe, and that which justifies ways of living that we want God to affirm. And
Right.
he doesn't, right? So you just have to watch that and to recognize human, we're fickle. We're not as smart as we think we are. And that's where having the ice bucket of scripture dumped on us daily, it sort of sobers us up. It sobers us up in keeping us from going off into the weeds like that. So that's probably my.
We're not brains on a stick.
So Dr. Madsen, there may be some listeners who are like, wow, I want to get more of that. I want to get in touch with you. I want to find out more about how I can study these kind of things at Midwestern. How can people get in touch with you? And could you tell us a little bit more of some of the resources that are available to students through Midwestern?
Yeah. One thing I would say is to get a hold of me. I'm Dean of Doctoral Studies at Midwestern, and you can dial 414-3700 and you'll get connected to me that way. Email address is T as in Tango, Madsen, M-A-D-S-E-N @mbts.edu. I'm available by email. As far as resources go, I would certainly want to direct people to, for example, the website For the Church. A lot of good resources there. The Midwestern Seminary website, you're going to have authors like Owen Strand, Jared Wilson, Matthew Barrett, etc., Pat Schreiner, all kinds of good stuff there. Also connected with For the Church Institute. So there are many different angles that you can use to get more information about these things. And certainly we would extend a hearty welcome to anyone who would want to visit Midwestern Seminary, Spurgeon College. They're on the same campus, obviously, and just come by. Let us give you a tour. Let us talk with you, talk about your ministry goals, how you think God might be using you, and what role higher education can play in that. We'd love to do that. That's what we're here, why we're here. We serve the Southern Baptist Convention, and that means we serve you.
And thank you again, Dr. Madsen, for joining us. Those resources are going to be listed in the show notes, including the books that were mentioned. And we look forward to seeing you next week.
And thank you for joining us, Thor. Thank you for listening today, everyone out there. Before you leave, make sure you smash the subscribe button, you share this with a friend, and leave us a positive rating and review in your favorite podcast app or platform. Go to missionspodcast.com to get more content. And until next week, thank you for listening.